Hello and welcome. These audio recordings are designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam, and today we will go over one of the more common Part C questions found on Paper 1. How successful was the Treaty of Versailles? You might find it useful to have a pen and paper to hand, or you might just want to listen through generally as part of your revision. That's okay too. Now, in terms of this question, it's a very popular one with students, possibly because it's the first thing that many people study at IGCSE History, and possibly just because it's a good topic to get your head around. So it's one that people generally seem to be happy about if it appears on the paper. But you need to be aware, for the 10-mark Part C question, that it won't come up in this form. Instead, you will have a statement followed by the question, how far do you agree? So it could take on the shape of, Versailles was mainly to punish Germany. How far do you agree? Or Versailles led to incredible German resentment. How far do you agree? Or David Lloyd George was unhappy with his outcomes from the Treaty of Versailles. How far do you agree? So you need to be able to twist and shape the evidence around the question set. But for the purposes of being thorough, this question will stick to the generic how successful was Versailles. We will also use the PEE format. That is to say, make a point, back it up with evidence in the form of names, dates, statistics, quotations, people, places and events, and then explain it, where possible in more than one way, using connectives such as this shows or this suggests. Okay, let's get going. How successful was the Treaty of Versailles? This response will break the argument up into two sides, both for and against the question, and it will give a 3-point scope, arguing first of all that the treaty was a success, and then secondly a 3-point scope arguing the treaty was not a success. So let's start with the treaty was a success. Point 1. It rewarded the winners. Evidence to support this point includes, well, it was natural at this time that at the end of a grueling 4-year war, the winners would want some sort of booty and some sort of reward. Reparations were eventually settled in 1921 at a cost of 6.6 billion UK pounds. Moreover, France and Britain controlled German mandates in Togoland, Cameroon and South Africa through the League of Nations. So financially, the victors were rewarded. Moreover, they were rewarded by not being blamed for the war. Article 231, the famous War Guilt Clause, exonerated the Allies from any sort of responsibility for starting the conflict. And so, in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that the treaty was a success in the sense that it rewarded the winners. Point 2. To punish Germany. Evidence to support this argument include, we must consider, after the horrors of World War I, that there was a real demand in public opinion in both Britain and France to really punish Germany for the war and make it pay for the damage, for the fathers, for the sons who'd been killed. British and French casualties were horrendous. One piece of evidence to support this is that over 2/3 of the French army, the poilus, were killed or injured. There were food and medicine shortages, and much of rural France had been devastated by shelling and farmland had been ruined. As such, one British government minister said he wanted to, quote, Get everything that you can squeeze out of a lemon and a bit more," unquote. Besides, the Germans had been extraordinarily harsh on the defeated Russians at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, demanding over a quarter of its railways and over a quarter of its population. Bitterness continued long after the fighting had stopped, having been fueled by a wartime propaganda machine. And so in explaining this point, surely one of the aims of the treaty was to punish Germany, and in that respect it certainly achieved it and can be said to be a success. Point 3. To cripple the German war machine. Evidence to support this includes: Germany was only allowed a puny army of 100,000 men and wasn't allowed a conscript army either. It wasn't allowed any armoured vehicles, submarines or aircraft. The Rhineland was demilitarised and the Anschluss or unification with Austria was forbidden. And the German Navy was only allowed 6 battleships. So in explaining this point, you might want to argue that France in particular, who had been invaded twice in 1870 and 1914, would have wanted to really cripple the German war machine to avoid another war. And in this sense, you could argue the treaty was a success because they certainly did do that. Okay, time for the magic words. On the other hand. We're now going to argue, with a 3-point scope, that the treaty was not a success. Point 1. German resentment. Evidence to support this includes: most Germans saw the agreement as a diktat or a forced agreement, and they spoke of signatories such as Gustav Bauer as November criminals. The treaty led to the theory of the Dolchstoß, or the stab in the back. There were several territorial issues, such as the misplaced German speakers, of whom there were 3.5 million in Czechoslovakia. Other issues included the massive indemnity of £6.6 billion UK at a time when Germany had lost 10% of its land, 12.5% of its population, 16% of its coalfields, and 50% of its iron and steel industry. And finally, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, was an especially hated aspect of the treaty. So in explaining this point, you may wish to argue the treaty was not a success because it fed nationalist sentiment in Germany and created huge resentment that eventually led to World War II. Point 2. It did not achieve a lasting peace. Evidence to support this includes: despite Wilson's 14th point, the League of Nations, war did break out again in Europe in 1939, and many point to the legacy of Versailles in this. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, had called for a treaty, quote, to protect the future, unquote, against war. But nevertheless, Britain and Germany were at war again in September 1939, and so in explaining this, you may wish to argue that the war to end all wars did not end all wars, and that in this sense, one of the aims of the Treaty of Versailles was clearly not hit, and that the treaty should not therefore be regarded as a success. Finally, point 3. Even the big 3 were not fully satisfied with the outcomes of the treaty. Evidence to support this includes: 77-year-old Georges Clemenceau, the French leader nicknamed the Tiger, was not happy because Germany was not broken up into smaller states, which is what Poincaré wanted. Germany had attacked France before in 1870, and he felt the treaty was not harsh enough and that Germany should be wiped from the map. There was even an assassination attempt on Clemenceau during the treaty itself. Wilson was also not happy. The Big Three met 145 times during the treaty, but even after all these meetings, he didn't achieve his 14 points. Many of the other leaders saw him as an idealist, and his interests often clashed with imperial powers such as Britain and France, and principles like self-determination and freedom of the seas were not to be granted. Finally, David Lloyd George, the Welsh wizard, was also not entirely happy because he still feared communism in Germany. He had promised in his 19 election to make Germany pay, but in reality he was wise enough to foresee the problems of a strict treaty. So, we have argued that the treaty was a success in the sense that it rewarded the winners, punished Germany, and crippled the German war machine. On the other hand, we've argued that it was not a success because it led to German resentment, did not achieve a lasting peace, and that the Big Three themselves were not wholly satisfied with the outcomes. Okay, now it's time to tie it all together with a clever conclusion. Well, it's easy to argue that the treaty was a failure with hindsight, but at the time it was seen as a fair agreement by many, but not all. Germany did manage to uphold much of the clauses of the treaty until 1923, and could be argued could have continued to honour it. As British historian W. Carr says, quote, "Germany could have fared much worse," unquote. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. If you did, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Mr. Guiney History, or if you prefer, you could subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye!